Welcome to the next instalment of Wipe On Pod, Your Places or Mine, with me, John Goodall, the architectural editor of Country Life.
And me, Clive Aslett. I'm the publisher of Triglyph Books.
So, Clive, what are we going to talk about today? I think we have a seasonal subject for the early summer, don't we? What is that?
Yes, we do, John. We're going to be thinking of people walking across lawns drenched in early sunshine with hampers and champagne and looking forward to a performance of the opera because where are we, John?
We are going to be at Glyndebourne.
It could be nowhere better.
But we're not just going to be talking, or in fact we're not really going to be talking about the wonderful new opera house that's there, but the story of how this building comes to be and the amazing circumstances in which Glyndebourne became a centre of opera, and the house that is the anchor to the opera house, which most people walk past when they go to Glyndebourne, but they don't really see, and they certainly don't go round, do they?
I think that's absolutely true. The house is essential to Glyndebourne. That's why it was founded there, and it's an integral part of the whole experience. But as you say, the event has kind of rather outgrown the house and has become something sui generis, its own thing, a bit different. But the house, people don't really spend enough time looking at, I don't think.
You have a glimpse of it, don't you, as you speed past on your way to the gate. If you look to your left as you go down the little village lane, and you see essentially a symmetrical, it looks like a Jacobean brick frontage, doesn't it?
Yes, I mean, it's a slight illusion, because I don't think you see very much of the Jacobean house, or whatever date the house was. I don't think you see so much of that now, because it was pretty much comprehensively Victorianised by an architect called John Christie in the 1880s. But it was an old house. It went at one point by the rather unpromising name of Wood's Tenement in the Hole. But then it took on the name of Glyndebourne. And Glynd means valley, and Bourne means one of those seasonal streams which dries up in the summer. So it was a rather more romantic name, really.
And there are fragments, aren't there, of a 16th century house there?
There are pretty much quite well hidden and embedded in the house itself.
It's quite interesting to think about the story of the house in the sense that I think typically with country houses you have a building constructed with services, and the services often outgrow the needs of the house as people move into the main building. And at Glyndebourne exactly the reverse has happened. The house services have grown and grown and grown and grown and become the opera house effectively.
Yes, that's a very good observation. I hadn't thought of it in those terms, but that is exactly what does happen. I think it was always pretty quirky in the sense that the house took on its present incarnation in the interwar period. And for a long time, it was the house of a bachelor. So it's quite unusual.
Yeah, so, I mean, can you introduce the founder of this little bit, Clive? Because it's a man called John Christie, isn't it?
Yes.
And there is a sort of, I mean, it's a fascinating... We were thinking we were going to divide the podcast into two with talking really about what happens, you know, when he builds the opera house in the second part, but just his backstory, I feel, fills the entire first part.
Absolutely. It's sort of unbelievable these days. It's a world which has vanished, the world of Evelyn Waugh and P.G. Wodehouse, and these characters who emerged from particularly wealthy families where they didn't really have to bother to please anybody except themselves. And he was this marvellous example. And there's a very, very good biography written, I think, in the 50s by Wilfrid Blunt. I so thoroughly recommend it to everybody. It's very, very fun to read. It's out of print, but you can get it quite easily in the usual places. But I suppose we should spool back and talk a bit about his family history and the source of the wealth and so on. And it emerged, the Christie family emerged from a family that was Swiss called Christen. And there was a Major Daniel Christen who was in the thoroughly reprehensible, as we would now say, East India Company.
And he made his fortune.
And he made his fortune. Of course, being a soldier in the East India Company was, all sorts of terrible things happened. But then, it was happening to other people who were pretty terrible in the way that they ruled their Indian subjects.
What sort of date is this?
This was the
early 19th century.
Well, no, this was the second half of the 18th century. Really. He was present at in the second Mysore war.
So with Tipu Sultan, and is that right? Was that another?
Can't
Oh no, we're
quite
going to get
remember.
ourselves into trouble, aren't we?
We're going to get
trying
into
to do
frightful
this
muddle.
spontaneously. So let's not do this.
I can tell you that he was part of it, whatever it was. He was present at a siege of a fortified house, and the siege was ended by this house being fired. So there were flames leaping out of it. And first of all, the lord of the house leapt out, and then his harem, one after another, leapt out. And they were met by these very rough sailors who sort of tore the earrings off these unfortunate ladies. But Major Christie stepped in and stopped them from being manhandled, and showed great gallantry in looking after them and restored them to the Lord, who they'd been fighting. But anyway, the Lord was so grateful for this that he told him where there was a great quantity of money to reward himself. And this was part of the origins of the fortune.
And do you think it's really a true story? How
I've
extraordinary.
got absolutely no idea. It's colourful, John.
It's colourful. It sounds like...
It's all we can say. But he then had, our John Christie's father was his grandson.
And he is himself a really peculiar character.
Well, he was a genuinely peculiar character in that he was very extreme. And
Clive, just 1 minute, just
Yes.
before you go on to... I mean, the point is that this Swiss, effectively mercenary, working for the East India
Yes.
Company, then moves to Britain and buys up estates. Is that...
Yes.
And so, I see. And so we now move...
So he's now seated in Britain. His grandson not only has these estates, but also he marries a daughter of the Earl of Portsmouth called Rosamond. And in a very Victorian way, they have this truly catastrophic marriage. I mean, it's not her fault. Or I mean, well, the trouble is he's really mad. I think he is actually more or less certified. I mean, I'm not quite sure whether he is. I don't think he's locked away, but he was very, very violent, and we know this because after a while it was intolerable, and they separated, and he left his fortune. He left his entire estate away from the family. He did not leave it to John. He left it to a remote cousin whom he'd never met, which is sort of slightly odd behaviour in the first place.
And then his wife challenges this in the courts, doesn't
Yes,
she?
that's right. And in the course of this trial, which is in the High Court and lasts for 15 days, so it was quite a thing. Can you imagine how much it all would have cost? She was exonerated, and because she was saying that he wasn't in his right mind when he made it. And they made the will. And the people representing this remote cousin, the barristers, called numerous witnesses who knew Augustus Christie and said, well, no, this is perfectly untrue. He was absolutely in his right mind because they were only seeing the outside. And then Rosamond revealed what the marriage was like. And he was very violent. She was often being attacked. And he was hurling plates around and grinding food into the carpet and going out into the garden, pulling up plants and behaving in a way that was not rational. And very violent.
And they have to demonstrate, don't they, that he had shown some warmth to his son, and that John Christie testifies that his father had shown sufficient warmth to raise his hat to him one day.
Yes, that's right. I mean, John... all this revelation in the court was astounding to everybody, not least to John, because it had always been hidden. You know, everything was hidden in a Victorian marriage. So John was as surprised as anybody, but he had kind of... one of the things was his father had always been very, very jealous, and he'd been very, very jealous of John from the moment he was a baby, because he was taking up Rosamond's time. So the relationship was not good. But John sort of, I don't know, rose above it in some kind of way. And he said, yes, more recently my father showed this great affection. One time we shook hands, and another time he raised his hat in the park.
And all this is important because, in fact, what happened was that he was almost smothered by love
Exactly.
by his mother. And
Yes.
his father really just had nothing, short of raising his hat,
No.
really had nothing to do with him. And this meant that when he went to school, this was
Yes,
an
I
enormous
think that's absolutely right. I
release.
mean, he had this very smothering relationship with his mother. I mean, the two were kind of very mutually dependent, but they didn't really understand each other. They weren't on the same wavelength. I mean, she was... she turned to her son because her husband was so ghastly. But, of course, naturally, he was terribly spoilt. And there are accounts of how he was behaving in a tremendously naughty way, sort of climbing trees, not going down, and throwing stones at the grooms. And
people just don't know how to control their children these days,
no,
do they?
Well, I mean, she took a birch to his hand and obviously sort of tapped it. He's, "Oh, do it again, Mummy. It didn't hurt at all." So it must have been... I mean, you can see he was developing into a very self-willed child. But it meant that he found great solace when he went to school. I think that when he first went to boarding school, it was a bit difficult because he was dressed up in these little Lord Fauntleroy clothes, which, of course, didn't go down very well with his peer group, as you can imagine. So he got rather sort of ragged and bullied. But he was a big fighter, and he sort of took on anybody bigger than him, and usually came off quite well. So that was foundational in terms of his character.
An Edwardian childhood in every particular Tom Brown school day.
Living by the strength of his fists. And then he went off to Eton, and he absolutely adored Eton. It was like a sort of Elysium in comparison to his childhood home, Tapley in Cheshire. They had all these estates, of which Glyndebourne was one. But he loved Eton. Eton was going through a slightly rare good patch at that time because the headmaster, Edmund Waugh, was a great rower, and he was a very sort of muscular Christian kind of individual. And I think probably not such a bad scholar. I don't really... No, but he was certainly known as great oarsman, but he wasn't a sort of sadist like many headmasters at that time were. And Christie thought it was absolutely fantastic. And when he left, he left Eton. He first of all went to Woolwich to go into the Royal Artillery.
But also, it's important to say he excelled, didn't he, at sports? That's what he loved.
Yes, he did. He excelled in sports, and he'd had a bad riding fall when he was a boy, and he broke his leg, and he always limped. But he still was playing squash, but unfortunately when playing squash he lost an eye.
So a ball hit him in the eye.
A ball hit him in the eye, can you imagine? Anyway, he had this glass eye, which of course he would take out to dramatic effect sometimes.
Oh, goodness. I remember somebody who had I suppose you don't know, but I remember someone who used to do exactly that with glass eye, who was a soldier who lost an eye.
Wow. I did sit next to somebody at lunch once who was a big donor of the Tory party, as it happens. Anyway, he, I thought rather ostentatiously, took out his hearing aids.
So tell me about yourself, Clive. Yes. He said, taking out his hearing aids.
No, after that, I rather gave up. But anyway, that is by the by. He loved this time at Eton. He was very interested in science. He was going to go into the Royal Artillery and decided not to. And he persuaded his parents, I think they were probably a bit reluctant, to let him go to Cambridge, which he did and he loved. And there he did sort of mineralogy and these sort of scientific pursuits. It was unusual.
Did he? Is there any? Music. Is there any evidence of him being interested in music when he was at school, or not that you're aware of, really?
He became a great friend of a master called Dr. Lloyd, and he was a very important person in the Glyndebourne story. And when he was at Cambridge, there are two things that really caught his imagination. One was motoring, and he begged his parents, and finally an uncle, I think, bought him a motor car, and it was a George Richard. I've never heard of that make of motor car, but Wilfrid Blunt said it was rather like his mistress. You know, he was always kind of buying at things and, and sort of altering it and making it a bit better, because he was very good at science, and so he sort of understood the workings of the motor car. And he did discover music when he was at Cambridge. Well, actually, possibly from Dr. Lloyd, because Dr. Lloyd was I think it might have been called a precentor of Eton, possibly. He was certainly a musician. And so that was probably the beginning of his interest. But he wasn't actually particularly good at music. He could just strum along on the piano, rather limited repertoire, I think. But he became a enthusiast for music. Anyway, the two coincided when, with Dr. Lloyd in the passenger seat, he took the George Richard off to Bayreuth, to the opera festival that Wagner founded in Bayreuth, a village near Munich. Yeah. And of course it was this theatre which Wagner persuaded mad King Ludwig of Bavaria to build for him to his own specification. But it's interesting that it's not actually in a country house, but it's in its own specially purpose-built theatre, and it's a festival. It doesn't happen all the year round. So, I mean, a seed might have been planted
when he was there. But that's him driving right across continental Europe, as it were. That must have been quite an adventure too. And then seeing this.
Yes, in the winter, he'd say to people, shall we go and get into the car? I'd love to go for a skid. Of course, he didn't know how to drive when he got the car. I mean, nobody did. So the first thing he did was to drive off to Birmingham to see whether he could do it.
It really is like Toad of Toad Hall.
Absolutely, yes. Well, possibly. I think you're probably quite right. Anyway, it was this very privileged thing, because this was before the First World War. And even, I think George Christie was probably, John Christie was kept on a fairly tight rein, I suspect.
Even despite those things. So what happened when the war did break out?
When the First World War broke out, John Christie was determined to join. He was in his early 30s, I think, at the time, and he had a limp. And furthermore, he only had one eye, but he managed to trick the people who were recruiting. There was a doctor who gave you a test, and he somehow managed to disguise his limp. And then he had the brilliant idea you had to have an eye test. And so the doctor said, close one eye and read these letters. And he closed he didn't have one eye, so he read with the other eye. And then the doctor said, close the other eye.
And he just kept the same one open.
He just kept the same one open. So that got him through. And then he was a really great hero in the war, but he refused any sort of recognition. He couldn't refuse. They insisted on giving him the MC, which is a high decoration, but he always put himself in danger. And
is this story that must have been almost intolerable, that under fire he would get out a copy of the Fairy Queen and read verses from it?
Yes, if there's one thing that's worse than being under fire, it's having somebody read the Fairy Queen to you.
Yes, I mean, you wonder where that interest came from. I mean, totally bizarre.
No, but it's fascinating though, isn't it? He kept a copy of the Fairy Queen in his pocket.
It's not a book I think of as... it's not something I think of as...
I can't read more than a couple of stanzas.
No. Anyway, Matt...
Anyway, he survived.
Lucky not to be shot by his own side, I would have thought.
Inflicted the Fairy Queen on him. But by that stage, even in the First World War, he was... I can't quite remember. I think he must have got shot up a bit, or he had some sort of leave. What's the word for having... when you're injured?
And he gets an... I mean, he's a very brave man, clearly.
Yes, he's a very brave man.
He gets an MC, sorry. So
yes,
it's important.
Yes, he's a very brave man. But he also is invalided home, or at least he's at home in sort of 1916. He's in Glyndebourne, where you can still hear the guns. Because Glyndebourne, we haven't actually established this, but it's near Lewes in East Sussex. Not very far from the coast, on the Downs.
So when the wind is blowing the right way, you can hear the guns.
Hear the guns in France.
That is quite a thought, isn't it?
Yeah. But he was getting Glyndebourne ready. He sort of did a deal with his father. He didn't really like Tapley, but of course it didn't hold very good memories for him, which is where he'd grown up. And he really loved Glyndebourne, which is quite a long way away. So he did a deal that he would, some sort of exchange of family property, that he would get Glyndebourne. And he talked about furnishing it with his mother, and he had very strong views. I mean, he really ignored all his mother's advice. That was rather the relationship that they had. But she didn't stop giving it.
And does his father, do you remember, does his father die when he's relatively young still?
No, he didn't die. I mean, they didn't see each other very much, but he died about, I think, 1931 or something. I think that's when the court case is.
I see. So, And so in the meantime, when he comes back from the war, what does he do?
Well, I should have said that before the war, he'd left... he hadn't gone to Woolwich, he'd gone to Cambridge. And when he left Cambridge, his parents were quite keen on him having something to do. Strictly speaking, it wasn't necessary because they were very rich. Yeah. But he thought what he wanted to do, and characteristically, he went back to Eton, but this time as a master.
Goodness
and he taught science.
Which would have been a brand new
idea. I don't think he was very good at it. His contemporaries said, well, he wasn't very good at explaining things. So,
as a teacher, that's not a natural
as a science teacher, I think there's a bit of a failing. But he was quite popular because he had this car, and he had a wonderful butler whom he was very close to called Childs. And Childs would sometimes turn up and say, I'm terribly sorry that Captain Christie has overslept, but he'll be along in the motor very soon. The boys loved that because he was a sportsman, and that was terrific for Eton boys at that time. So he was sort of much adored by the boys, and I think there's a story about some. What?
It's totally hopeless, but yes.
Yes.
But
There's
as a teacher,
about some sort of pump, sort of. Anyway, it wasn't any good for doing whatever scientific experiment it was supposed to do, but it's very good for pumping up the tyres of the car.
So, turning these things to different accounts, yes. Gosh, it's rather funny, isn't it? To think, you can imagine a sort of charismatic teacher, indeed, who everybody rather enjoys having them teach him.
I think there's more room. I mean, these days, public schools tend to be exam factories, of course, rather luxurious ones, but there was much room for individualism, and people didn't really care very much what children were taught.
And as
parents, they weren't pushy.
As Captain Christie, did he go back to Eton to teach at Eton after
yes,
the war?
Yes, he did. He did for a time. I can't quite remember how long. I don't think it was a very long time. But he, I think he decided he was going to pursue the life of a country gent, and he was in Glyndebourne, and Dr. Lloyd, who was a great friend, who's much older than him, he was now sort of in his late 60s. Decided to retire from Eton, and so he said to him, why don't you come and retire to my part of the world or live at Glyndebourne, because he was only living there by himself. And Dr. Lloyd said, well, I couldn't do that because there isn't an organ I can play within striking distance. So John Christie said, well, that's not a problem because I can build one at Glyndebourne. And so he went about, in those days this was quite a thing, yes. Organs in country houses, because they were much advertised, in fact, in country life. They were particularly an American thing. There was something called the Aeolian Pipe Organ Company. But they were very plutocratic because these big organs, for one thing, you had to have an enormous space. So yes. Sometimes houses were kind of more or less built around the organs. But there were great things in America, and people like Andrew Carnegie, the steel magnate, had one at his castle in Scotland, because he came from Scotland originally, called Skibo Castle, and that's an enormous one. And I went once with a friend to the island of Rum, where there's Kinloch Castle.
That's extraordinary building.
It was very run down at the time, but we thought it was a great jape, and we packed our dinner suits and insisted on ordering the biggest dinner we could find. And the organ was played for us, and it was really wonderful. Because it was like a pianola. It played on a roll. So you didn't actually have to know how to play the organ in this instance. And I suspect probably the Glyndebourne one was the same.
And it is, yes, it's worth...
So, before you had gramophones,
yes.
It was a way of producing music. If you were because these were vastly expensive, these big ones, but it played these sort of military marches and things. These were rather sort of popular classic.
And dances, presumably. I think some of those...
We weren't dancing.
You were... But, and some of the organ rooms are huge, presumably,
yes,
in order for people to be able to dance.
Well, I'm sure, because dancing was such an important thing. Actually, John Christie, he wasn't particularly good at music, he wasn't particularly good at dancing, and he said to his mother, who was, of course, typically trying to get him to go to these dances to meet somebody whom he could marry, he said, well, I'm getting a bit better at dancing. I think he was taking lessons from his cousin. I'm getting a bit better at dancing, but frankly, they're a terrible bore because there's no point in talking to all these girls. You only talk to them for 2 or 3 minutes, and frankly, it's completely boring. Fortunately, I'm very tolerant, which I think was either ironic or showed absolutely no self-awareness whatsoever. But anyway, he had this great big organ, and yes, dancing was very important. As a sort of social activity, wasn't it? So almost certainly used for dancing.
So he builds, I mean, we're going to get onto the house and the opera house properly, but it is worth just saying it. I mean, he builds this enormous organ, doesn't he?
Well, he not only builds the enormous organ, he builds an
yes.
enormous hall. A
Yes.
great big, and it's significant. The name of the headmaster of Eton was Edmund Warre, as I said, Warre, however you pronounce it. The architect is Edmund Warre.
But not the same
Not
person.
the same man, his son. So isn't it extraordinary that he's chosen, I mean, Eton was so important for him that to think of an architect, he immediately thinks of one of the people he met through this Eton connection.
Yeah.
And Edmund Warre, I think it must be Warre, was an architect not particularly well known, of a sort of rather arts and crafts tendency, I think. I mean, not a bad architect, but not a very distinguished one.
And he doesn't produce many buildings, does he?
No, sort of church restorations, that kind of thing. And Christie, with all his money, could have gone to anybody. But anyway, he chose Edmund Warre, and he produced this great big hall with a coved ceiling. It's tremendous. And one end is completely taken up by this organ, which could be in a cathedral. Well, the trouble was that Dr. Lloyd died.
It's before the thing is even finished.
Before the thing was finished, and that was a bad stroke of luck.
Amen. The whole thing.
Not only for Dr. Lloyd, but for the organ, because Christie was left with this project, which the person who kind of designed the organ was no longer there to implement. So whenever he talked to the organ builders, he was very tempted to add something else on. And so he got sort of bigger and bigger, and had these enormous pipes that when they were played the first time, bits of plaster started falling down from the ceiling, which he thought was fantastic. Really, this Wagnerian effect of Valhalla crashing down about his ears.
So you couldn't really play the organ?
No, and so
Or not
the organ builders who said, "Well, we never said this was going to be a good idea. We're in complete despair." He bought the organ company, so they couldn't very well. He tended to buy companies for transport, because you needed transport at a country house. He bought a transport company, or possibly elevated the works. I mean, certainly this happened in the case of the estate office. It was sort of elevated into the Ringmer Building Company, and became a building company. So he kept on having these ideas. And in the case of the organ, he had this idea of buying up, of cornering the market
And buying up
in
the
the
company.
ivory that would produce the ivory for organ keys. He was going to corner the market. And this was going to be the most fantastic business wheeze, because everybody would have to go to him for their keys.
But that didn't work.
I don't think particularly.
Yes, he doesn't. He sounds like a man of amazing ideas, but not necessarily successful ones.
Well, some of them were successful. And indeed, Glyndebourne, the actual opera, I mean, look at that. But some of them were successful. I think the building company was... there were other things. I think he might have had, inevitably interests in motor cars and that type of thing. So, I mean... It was a slightly scattergun approach, but it was, it shows great entrepreneurial kind of vigour.
It does.
He just jumped in with both feet, and sometimes it worked, and sometimes it didn't.
And as you said,
I think that the organ company did work. The organ company did, because he bought the company. It did work for a time, because of course, in the 20s and 30s, they needed cinema organs.
So he became involved in cinema.
So I don't think it was what he had in mind originally, but it did work. It had a brief flourishing, and then, of course, it was replaced by, when talkies came in.
It was suddenly irrelevant. Well, listen, as you say, we haven't even talked about the opera, which is indeed his great success, but that is for part 2. And
a romantic story, John.
Also a romantic story that explains how it comes to pass. A really fascinating one. Excellent. Well, we'll look forward to that. Well, welcome back, and now we need to talk about the opera house itself and how that came into being, because, as Clive has already said, there's a rather touching story behind this, isn't there?
Yes, there's a pre-story, which was that there was John Christie living alone, really, in Glyndebourne, and so he took in a couple of very upmarket sort of paying guests in the 20s, really. And one of them was, I think it was called Mounsey. Johnny Mounsey, I think he was called. Anyway, he was the director of Barclays Bank, and he and his wife were intensely musical. I think they might all have again gone off to Bayreuth together. And this was sparking an idea of wanting to have music in Glyndebourne and it being something that could happen. Sadly, in, I think, 1929, Johnny Mounsey, to everyone's astonishment, went off into the woods and shot himself. So there was this terrible tragedy which befell, and inexplicable. He appeared to have a happy family life with 4 children. There were no financial difficulties, and so that was very sad. But John Christie had been living in this house, and not only with no chatelaine, as it were, but you'd think no obvious prospect of one. I mean, he was now, I think, about 50 or something like that, and he had good male friends, but it was not in the way that we would immediately think of now as being an intimate relationship. They were just friends. They were just male friends, as far as we know.
You mentioned mistresses earlier. Did he have lots of mistresses or not?
No, the car was his mistress.
Oh, I see. Sorry.
Because he lavished love on the car.
On the car, I see.
But I don't think. No, I think not. I mean, it was strange because he was not interested at all in all these Debs. These Debs that he might have been dancing with.
That's interesting.
And so he appeared to be. I mean, this was a phenomenon which I think is difficult for our society to understand because we see everything immediately in sexual terms. But I don't think in the early 20th century this was the case because it wasn't an option for most people. You had to be Oscar Wilde if you were going to have homosexual relationships. And I don't think this was what John Christie was like. I think he just was a bachelor. But he was a bachelor of long standing, so to speak. And then into his life, singing in his hall, the abduction from the Seraglio, possibly appropriately, was a young soprano called Audrey Mildmay. And supposedly, on this visit to Glyndebourne, John Christie showed around the house and opened one of the bedroom doors and said, "This will be where we will sleep when we are married." So he was not, he made his mind up pretty good, not backward. And whether or not that story is true, it was certainly a sort of whirlwind romance on his side. And he bombarded Audrey with letters and largesse. And she was singing. She was the daughter of a vicar from Hurstmonceau, so not very far away, which is also in Sussex, so not such a long way from Glyndebourne. Mildmay, there was a shipping line, wasn't there, I think?
That's right.
But I don't know whether they were connected. But she was very well behaved, and one packet arrived at the door to an opera house somewhere or another. I think it was up north because it was rather cold. And she thought it was flowers, and so she opened it in front of everybody. And it turned out to be full of furs.
From John Christie?
Yes, because he was very worried that she might be getting cold. And, in those days, you couldn't possibly, that was, only a tart would have accepted. So, that actually was rather compromising. So, there was then a great tussle.
But she writes a delightful letter, doesn't she?
Oh, she does. I've got to read it. I've got to start up my computer in order to access it. She writes, "My dear John, 2 letters from you this morning." So, I mean, she was absolutely
bombarded.
Both charming. Yesterday's is, I think, one of the very nicest letters I've ever had in my life. You are such a darling, John, that I don't want you to fall in love with me. Please. I think it's such a lovely letter, that. And I think it's very kind of revealing of that age. I mean, girls like her, they were used to men falling in love with them all the time, and they just waited until they found the one that they wanted to marry, and then probably that was it in the majority of cases. Not every case, but in the majority.
But there's something very pleasantly kind of sort of standoffish with that, well, being very warm, isn't there?
Yes.
About that, saying, yes, please, it's just back off a little
bit. Charming, and sort of quite, considerate of him.
Yes.
Because he was an older man who'd just gone absolutely potty about her.
But in the end, she does succumb, doesn't she? Falls in love with him.
The campaign waged by John Christie, who would stop at nothing, actually works in a remarkably short time, because 6 months later they were married.
Do you think she made him promise not to read The Fairy Queen? and then she said, all right, I will.
Anyway, she was an opera singer, and so the idea of a festival, which might have been brewing in his mind for a while, came into fruition. And he was thinking about it. I mean, we have to remember that this was a time when opera in this country, in Britain, was not in very good heart, put it that way. I mean, it was in a very ropey condition. I think it had. I don't think opera was really a Victorian thing. I think they had oratorios. There was a lot of singing. There was a lot of, Britain was excelled at choral singing, but not opera. I think opera would have been regarded as risque. I mean, Handel, for example, had the Italian opera. It was all continental people and castrati, and which we didn't have, I don't think.
But how interesting that this sort of opera is getting on its feet again in the 50s. I had not really thought of that. I mean,
well, this is before that. This is in 1934. Yeah. Glyndebourne opens. So, but I think really it was not so much getting on its feet again. I think even at Covent Garden it would have been at a very low ebb. I mean, to be honest, I remember when I first went to the opera in when I was a child, when I was 70s, say. It was very hit and miss if you went to Covent Garden. I mean, you had these ropey old productions, and sometimes you had good singers, or you very often had productions with some good singers and some really bad singers. It was. We were not famed as a country which did opera, but Christie had gone to Bayreuth, which is the seat of the gods in terms
pinnacle of quality. So, in the opera house is created very much in response to his new wife. In other words,
yes, I think it was something they could do together, and to do it, they needed to build a theatre, which Edmund Warre came back to do. And he did do a very good job. I mean, you can't really attach a fly tower to a house and think that it fits in a very conventional way. And because it's overscale, you can't help that, really. But he was a sort of bit of a sub-arts and crafts architect. And it's done, isn't it, John, in very good materials, very sympathetic.
Well, the bits that survive of his original... And I mean, it does seem to fit in with a complete reorganisation of the house, doesn't it? I mean, we haven't really talked about that in great detail, but I mean, Warre also clearly, he refronts the house and creates that rather severe frontage out of what had been a Gothic or sort of Elizabethan...
Wasn't that surely... I think that might be from the 1880s, more or less. But he kind of revamps the house.
He reconfigures it, doesn't he? And he puts these strange little porches that you can't see the front door, the front door is turned inwards on a turret, and he truncates one of the towers.
Oh yes, actually, they do that.
They do. But it's not really a Gothic building, is it? When the Victorian house is not really Gothic, but it's sort of Jacobean, and then it's made slightly more severe. And internally...
What's the Jacobean house in Lincolnshire? I'm trying to remember the name of it.
Yeah, well, don't alarm me. Because I don't know where... there are one or two I can think of.
Burton Agnes.
Burton Agnes. In Yorkshire, it's in Yorkshire.
Surely, isn't it just...
It's just north of Humber.
Well, you shame me again.
Our listeners can write in and pillory one another.
The doors are like that. They're at right angles.
Yes.
Aren't they?
That's right, facing one another. It's exactly... Yes, this is exactly the same. And... there is in the house, when we were looking through the albums, we were very kindly shown by the present member of the family, Gus. There were photographs of the different forms of the theatre, because it clearly becomes very rapidly, it becomes more and more popular. And so what initially has two aisles down the sides, the aisles opened out to create more seats for the auditorium. And then, of course, the whole thing is completely swept away to create the present enormous and very elegant opera house that's there today. But there are all these different versions of it, and there's a green room.
Yes. And yes, I think that, of course, the dressing up aspect was important to Christie, but then, of course, that's what people did. People in country houses dressed for dinner. And he thought it was a good idea for people to wear dinner jackets when they went to the opera, or lovely gowns in the case of the... women, because it showed respect.
For the music, and
because we weren't a musical nation and didn't really know how to behave. So So that was important.
And I think it's important. I mean, we do tend to see these things in isolation, don't we? And Glyndebourne, of course, is now an internationally renowned opera house. But,
it's astounding.
But there are many parallels for this. That there are houses where, one of the obvious ones is Stansted, isn't Stansted Park, with Lord Bessborough creating a theatre. He's a great theatre enthusiast, and getting Goodhart Rendell to construct a theatre beside the house, and that initiative, it burns down in the war, but the initiative becomes the Chichester Theatre, doesn't it?
Yes.
And there's we went to see it together, which now become a military hospital. Which has that extraordinary
Stanford Hall in Staffordshire.
In
that part of it.
It is in that part of the world,
and now it's the.
A hospital, isn't it?
Yes,
been converted.
it is.
But that has a Wurlitzer organ that
Oh yes, that was amazing. Well, that was the yes. Well, that was actually more or less that was from the 30s, wasn't it? So it was actually just exactly the same time.
It may be one of his organs. Who knows? One of his Wurlitzers. You never know.
Oh, I'd like to think so. We had a very funny conference there, and David Watkin rose, who was a professor of architectural history, rose from the pit,
playing the Wurlitzer
organ. I was reading about a house the other day called Broomhill Park, and that had a theatre, but the owner, the Victorian, late Victorian, so 1890s owner, was a scientist, and the theatre was partly for the demonstration of his scientific experiments to his guests. I mean, imagine what a boring evening that would be.
But
they were earlier. I mean, it was very vexed. I mean, theatres and country houses were very vexed. Yes. It was a very vexed topic, weren't they? I mean, Mansfield House, Jane Austen's Mansfield
Park.
Mansfield Park, that turns on this disastrous.
And it has
play.
A terribly, terribly long history. I mean, in different forms. I mean, from the masks,
and
all these things. Of course. And I mean, but this idea of creating a formal space for things for entertainments attached to the house is very, very long standing. But it is interesting that there is this little burst of these things in the interwar years, of which Glyndebourne forms a part.
Of course, Lord Bessborough looked very much like Laurence Olivier, as he was very conscious
of this similarity. Oh, I didn't know that. So his acting,
or Larry, as he would call him.
So his acting had a context. His enthusiasm.
Yes, he did act. I mean, he was very, very keen on the theatre, and but I think he would rather have been an actor than an earl, to be quite honest. But that didn't happen.
And I mean, the interesting thing is that Glyndebourne has now become part of a phenomenon of country house opera that is in itself, the most expensive of all the arts, involving more people, and yet within the context of country house, there's numerous country house operas, and none of them are funded by the state or.
No, that's very true. Glyndebourne isn't at all.
It is an extraordinary.
It is an extraordinary thing. I wasn't very keen on Glyndebourne for a long time, partly because I thought you couldn't get tickets, and partly because we lived in London, and I thought, well, there's a lot of opera in London. London is a great musical city, one of the greatest in the world. And I thought, well, why go to the trouble of flogging all the way down to Sussex, getting dressed up, and having all the nuisance of getting a picnic together when you can go and hear something better in London? But I'm now converted, partly because my children like it very much, because if you're in your 20s, they have this wonderful 30 under 30 scheme. You can get these tickets for 30 quid. So it's very affordable for young people, and it's very, very nice. So that's good. I've discovered you can get tickets, which I thought you couldn't. But the other thing was that I was asked to write a piece for, if you can imagine the glamour of it, John, a cover story for Tatler. Which involved going to interview the chatelaine of Glyndebourne today, Daniel Denise, married to Gus Christie, who is, again,
a great opera
echoing the relationship with John Christie, Gus Christie's grandfather, is an opera singer. And so, can you imagine how fabulous that was? Going down on a day when it was all closed and we were behind the scenes, and she was wearing these fantastic dresses, and all the Tatler crew going around on high heels, all talking in foreign, the photographers talking in many foreign languages, and Daniel is wearing these dresses which had huge sort of collars and things. It's fantastically, it was appropriately operatic.
Yes, which only an opera singer could carry off.
And the collars so tall that there had to be somebody hidden behind them to hold them up. I mean, I was then completely converted. I've been many times since, and it is so fabulous. And of course, the quality of what's done is so high. But I was reading a piece by a professor of music at Oxford, which was looking into this phenomenon of country house opera, because, as you say, there are now many iterations of it, aren't there? And I think she made reference to the experience economy was one word she'd picked up from somebody else. And, the experience of going, and this is actually slightly pejorative, but which I don't really mean, but the experience of going is actually in some cases greater than the thing. The experience of consuming is greater than the good you are ostensibly going there to enjoy.
And it's worth saying, I mean, almost finally, that, of course...
It's also, the other thing she said is that it's immersive. And that's because you're going into this strange, beautiful place in this, often like Glyndebourne, in this beautiful countryside, and you're plunging into this experience and sort of your head over heels and below the waterline. You're fully immersed in it. And she said, well, this has always been part of the character of opera. Think of, Handel's Ronaldo, where they release sparrows into the audience to enhance, I suppose, the woodland effect or something, the sound of
birds. But it is worth saying also that the house itself plays a really important role, doesn't it, then and now? Because, the principal musicians are staying in the house.
Yes.
And the interior of the house is done up in the 30s. It's a kind of classic 30s interior in all sorts of ways, isn't it?
It's really absolutely wonderful, because the interior has changed very little. And one might say that by the standards of luxury hotels these days, the bedrooms might be described as a bit Spartan.
Yes.
And yet everybody wants to live there, because it's this wonderful community they have, being in a... I mean, again, that's immersive for the
artists as
well.
For
the artists
who are there. But I mean, yes, these wonderful details, the basins in little cupboards in the bedrooms, and the bathrooms.
Oh, it's wonderful.
Laid up in what were once dressing rooms. I mean, curiously enough, it's something that luxury hotels try and emulate, but it's a sort of style they try and emulate, but in a totally different way.
No, it ends up being like the White Lotus.
Yes, exactly. But I mean, it was sort of fascinating to see that, and to see this, as we started saying, this building that the tail wags the dog in a way at Glyndebourne, but the dog is still very, very important, and
the dog is still there, and the kitchen, another thing, which is
with wonderful painted cupboards,
which can never be changed, because it's got these wonderful cupboards which are painted with, as you were saying, with playing cards,
yes,
but by somebody who designed sets in the 1960s, I think.
It is a really extraordinary thing. And of course, the whole thing is still a family concern. I mean, that's the other amazing thing that Gus Christie is continuing. What his grandfather, his grandfather began, which is an extraordinary thing. Anyway,
may it never change.
May it never change.
Of course, have we said that the opera house itself was rebuilt about 1990, wasn't it, by Michael Hopkins? But
yes,
very, very successful. Manages to keep this sense of intimacy, even though it's on a much bigger scale.
And is more it becomes self-contained, doesn't it, as an experience when you go there, that you walk through, and it becomes its own.
And of course the gardens are very, very important. Typically John Christie chose a gardener by saying, "Can you grow peas?" Yes. "Can you grow leeks?" Yes. "Well, you got the job."
And on that note...
But it was very successful. Good way of doing things, I think.
Excellent.
We could all learn from it.
Excellent. And we look forward to the next... I don't know quite what the next one in our series is, but we have something up our sleeves, don't we? What is it?
We certainly do. We'll have to have a think.
We just can't remember.
John and I have remembered what we're going to talk about next week, and that is the glorious North Yorkshire country house, which is Castle Howard. A house with very strong associations with Brideshead Revisited, but moreover one that has just been magnificently redisplayed, and John, the lucky fellow, has been there. So, look forward to seeing you, I hope, next Thursday, and in the meantime, visit our new website, if you have a chance, created by the genius, that is Daniel Mackay, and there you can sign up to our newsletter and receive regular prompts and advices about what we are doing next. See you next time.